Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and thank you for attending tonight's talk. I hope we have a great discussion. And so hopefully there'll be some points raised. We can have a great Q&A that can be more of a discussion. And I hope this feels more like a conversation starter more so than a conversation ender. So hopefully we'll begin conversations around these topics as you move forward in your own development as both scholars and budding scholars and talking to the students specifically. So thank you again for that introduction. It's always weird to hear introduction read. It's like, is that me? What are they talking about? I'm still not getting used to it. I'm still an introvert on the inside. I'm just learning how to be a little bit better on the, a little bit more engaging on the outside. But one of the things I want to start with before I really get into my presentation is really one of the great things that I remember being able to have a conversation about. One of the things I'm always asked is, how did I get into researching China? Like what inspired me to research China, to learn Chinese and to do this research? And for me, it came from a place of just being exposed at an early age. I went to a primarily Black high school in Lithonia, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta, and it was there I had a Chinese teacher. And from there, it was my exposure to go to Chinese, to learning Chinese, the language, my ability to go to China. And from there, my experiences in China that really led me to do this work and thinking through and thinking about race beyond the U.S. context. As a Black woman who's born and raised in the South, I'm from Georgia. There, you're in some ways you understand the ways in which people are racialized. You understand the ways in which race and identity function in different places. And I never thought about it in a global context until I was able to go overseas myself. And so, thinking through these ideas and my own experiences, I wanted to go back and think through kind of previous experience of other African Americans who had gone to China. And that was something I learned about in my graduate studies, something I never learned about in my undergrad studies. And I wish I had, because I was like, this would have been something I would have loved to research on my own. But I think in one case, in many ways, it expands our ideas of how we think about the world around us and how we think about these conversations and these topics as well. So with that being said, I'll kind of begin my presentation and thinking through these ideas of racialization and class struggles. Recently, I've been thinking more critically about these questions, moving beyond the dissertation project itself and kind of thinking through the contemporary moment and using a historical lens to kind of understand as well how we think about the concepts and of racialization and how that happens, how we think about it. So today's topic is going to be mostly a historical perspective because I am a historian. So it's going to be historical kind of an analysis of some of these topics. And I'm going to look at African Americans more closely, but thinking about this in the larger kind of global China context, and hope we get some lessons we can take from today that we can apply to maybe some of the contemporary moments as we think about China's kind of new global China that is, we know of now, where China has so much engagement with many parts of the world, including the African continent as well as many parts of the Caribbean. And so how we can think about what these lessons may do. So that being said, thanks again for allowing me to be here. As I mentioned, I work at Tennessee State University. It's an HBCU, Historically Black College University here in Nashville. So I always want to shout out my HBCUs and say, I bring you greetings from the land of golden sunshine. Go Big Blue. So I want to give us the kind of context of a few frameworks that I use for my own research that allows me to think through some of these questions, because, and we're thinking about the Mao era, and appeared in my research specifically from 1949 to 1972, just a few years prior to Mao Zedong's death. I think about these moments in terms of how do we look through and how do we analyze these non-state actors, because at the period that they're engaging with African Americans, they're kind of asking them to come to China. They're inviting them to come through different organizations, through different ambassadors. They're asking them to come to China to be part of this new China that they're trying to promote. And so for me, using the lens of culture allows me to think about and think through analysis of non-state actors. Mao Zedong and others have these, famous speeches about calling people from Africa and from Asia and from Latin America to come together. But in those large kind of and those calls, when we call them out continents, these continental calls, solidarity, of color solidarity specifically, where do African Americans fit in when they are part of the American experience? They're part of their Americans. And so what happens in those moments? How do we think about their placement or the ways in which they fit into these calls of solidarity? And so I think through in a lens of culture and different cultural experiences that allow me to think through how we think about these one-to-one interactions. How do we think about the individual level, what happens on the ground level, what happens in the archival material that talks about, the translators and what they're having conversations about, that discusses the experiences when they come back from China of these African American cohorts, and how we think through is fostering or this further cultural understanding as a soft diplomacy tactic. And so one thing I use is music. I won't do too much of that today. I'm thinking more in politically, but there is a long legacy and a history of music as its cultural means and connector. Thinking about people such as Paul Robeson, who, while he never goes to China, he has a huge presence in China. While we have people like Abi Pankey, another research subject of mine, who goes to China in 1955 for 2 months, and he's traveling there, and how they're connecting Negro spirituals with Chinese folk music. So how these connections are being made through culture, and how those are some ways fostering ties and building connections in some interesting ways. And so I like to think about the idea of culture as a means of how to engage in these non-state actors. Um, also think through different concepts of thinking through the idea of blackness. This is a framework I use, and it's one that is very useful to me because while I'm analyzing networks of difference in the China space, how they understand identity formation, what does it mean to be Chinese, how do we understand Chinese-ness, how do we understand those identities and the ways in which that works, both legally but also individually in this period. Because as we many of you, as we may know, may or may not know, the idea of the 56 national the ethnicities, the national, the Shaoshuminzu, those ethnic nationalities. That is a project that comes about in the early 50s, just a few years after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And so this project of classifying people, giving names to different groups, how this process itself in some ways creates identities, but also subsumes and overlooks identities in many cases, where we have this group and how that group has never expanded since 1950. And so it's like, how has this not ever expanded enough, and since the 1954, 1955, the project that was created at the 56 groups. And so thinking through this ideas of identity and network formation in China, but also thinking through on the other side, the idea of blackness for the individuals who I'm looking at, who are engaging with China in these spaces. And so there's a work by Michelle Wright. Her work I love. I use her work all the time. I use her definition a lot because it is a definition for me that allows for expansion and helps me kind of think through some of the issues I was having in doing my own particular research in terms of, instead of identifying what blackness is, thinking about when and where it is being imagined, defined, and performed. And while it sounds so simple, that shift, it is a huge shift because it takes from what, trying to put a singular definition onto an identity that in some ways is not singular. In some ways, the idea of when and where gives you flexibility to, in some ways, engage with the people you're talking about. It allows you to see the difference, even if it's in the same time period. It allows you to see the difference in terms of how one understands themselves and how they express and how they define their blackness in many cases, and how they, in some ways, what I call performativity of race, the idea of using performance, and not in terms of performance in terms of someone putting a show, in terms of where it feels inauthentic, not in that terms, but thinking about performativity in terms of how one understand themselves, and how race as part of their one of their identities is a way they in some ways engage with the world around them. How in some ways is, in this moment, what do I do in some ways, how is I'm showing myself, how do I engage with these different people, and how do I in some ways showing my authentic self in these different moments, how am I presenting myself in these particular moments. And it also in some ways allows to think about, when thinking about performativity, the idea of an audience and a performer, the idea of who is the one performing and how is it being received by the particular audience, and how is it being then understood, transferred, and then reciprocated, or in some ways, ideas come about, or is it being challenged from the ideas they have about that particular group itself. One thing I like think about using the idea of performativity. I was recently asked this question: why performativity, and not thinking about and thinking about the semiotics and thinking about the ways in which ideas are formed. Thinking about language, performativity allows me to focus on the individual and focus on their individual agency in a way. So not focus on just the process that created these ideas, but also the individuals who are moving in that space, how they're in some ways negotiating, they're navigating, they're negating these ideas as well. And so give an example when I think about performativity, for example, Du Bois. W. Du Bois and his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, go to China. And there's a great archive at UMass Amherst. It's actually, I think it's digitized, I believe. It's a video of one of their trips. And I believe it's either 1959 or the 1961 trip. And it's a video where they're showing the way they're being hosted. And we kind of get a sense of what's happening and kind of gives a view of their world. And we see that at a banquet, they have these huge banquets. And so if you ever get a chance to be, someone special in the China space, you go to these huge banquets. It's a huge fanfare. We have performers and you have these dishes, and it's just absolutely amazing. And they're at this banquet that's held in Du Bois's honor, and they asked them to, talk to the people and kind of, speak. And him and his wife decided to sing a Negro spiritual in that moment. And so again, that idea of why that choice, why singing that Negro spiritual, what are they in some ways evoking in that moment? It's in some ways really shows an example of thinking about performativity of race, allowing them to think about it and think through who they are and showing themselves in this moment through this idea of this is who we are and this is how we're connecting to these particular places and cultures. And so I love this idea of what she talks about, this idea of Blackness and how we think about it and expand it, because even that example of Du Bois and his wife, we might have a teasing out because they're two different people. And so we have this idea of even that space, they're both having the same space, the identity and the definition that Wright gives us allows us to tease out hers versus his, and gives us a space to think through these ideas and have a multiplicity of ideas and thoughts about Blackness, and how we can some ways and think through how this can also be a space we can think through and engage in the China space as well. Um, and then also my African American cohort, the people I am looking at and analyzing. Some of my research, the manuscript project, which I'm trying to get it done. I'm trying to get it done. But the project itself, it takes a closer look at more pre-1949 ideas about Blackness as it relates to African Americans specifically. And so there's another chapters in there kind of thinking through what happens before and kind of seeing 1949 as this defining kind of shifting moment. And then what is carried over into 49 or what has changed post 1949 as a moment. But I think about this cohort because the ones I researched in the Maoist era, they're not the first ones to go to China. There's a whole cohort of African Americans who go prior to, they go to during the Republican era. Many of them are jazz musicians. So again, this kind of cultural exchange pre 1949 as well. Langston Hughes goes. So again, this idea of literary exchanges, literature from many writers of the Harlem Renaissance, Claude McKay's poem "If We Must Die" that goes to China. So there's a huge kind of mixing where as China is thinking through its identity as a nation state, post the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, in many cases, some of the works and some of the writings and things of, and kind of the writings of and writings from African Americans are helping to shape their national identity in some interesting ways that we kind of see also being part of the conversation post 1949. But tangent aside, apologies. Thinking about the ideas is that one of the questions I want to think about again is the agency of the individuals. And so while they're being invited to China for a particular purpose, as scholar Anne-Marie Brady writes in her book, "Making the Foreign Serve China," there is an intention behind it. What the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is doing as the nation, the People's Republic of China, there is an intention behind it, and so they're very intentional about who they're inviting and through what channels and what avenues and what they are seeing when they go to and come visit and are invited to see parts of what they call the new China. But also these individuals are choosing to make to go around the world, to go to China, because think about it, in this time period of the Mao era, you cannot, as an American with the American passport, just fly from New York to Beijing. That was not an option. And so they're making all these different, changes and stops to get there. So, for example, William Worthy, one of the first reporters to go to China. He first flies to Hong Kong, which is still under British control then prior to 1997. So still British Hong Kong. He goes to Hong Kong and then crosses into mainland China. So they're making these risks and they're making calculated choices to say, why am I making this decision to go to China? What is it about this? And so I want to, in some ways, think about their agency as well. What is happening and what are they doing for? What is their intention for inviting and to accept this invitation as well? And so thinking about performativity of race allows me to reinsert their agency in some ways and think about how they're shaping this space as well. What is it for them? How is this a space of possibilities for them as well? And so I think as Rodney Kelly has mentioned in his article Black Like Mao, him and Kelly and Betsy Esch, as well as his book Freedom Dreams. They talk about the idea of China as this space. It seems like this space of potential because it is a new space, and they see the ways in which the CCP has taken this ideology and used it to fit its own situation. So they're in some way seeing China as this ideal, and how we can see this as being part of a larger conversation that Mao was able to tap into and to really think through these ideas about racialization and class. So the global context, there's a lot going on in this particular period, thinking about Mao and thinking about the ideas. So we have a few moments. And so the first two are very much closely aligned, and thinking through Sino-Soviet relations, thinking through, these neighbors, the Soviet Union, well, now is at the point, at this point, was the USSR. So the USSR and China. And what is a relationship beyond just the shared border? We also have this kind of political relationship through the Communist International, or the Comintern, and how we see in many cases that relationship is very much shaped by their own ideologies, but it's also impacted by U.S. relations, what's happening with the U.S. and China at this moment. So we have this idea where China is post 49. They've come out of years of civil war between the CCP and the KMT, the Kuomintang. Not to mention they had the war in the Pacific, the war with Japan that began in 1937, that lasted for 8 years on their domestic space as well. So you have a civil war, a war with Japan, and then a civil war resumes until 1949. So you have decades of war that ravaged the country itself. And so you have a weakened people who are just overwhelmed and exhausted from all this war, not to mention other issues of inflation and other questions and things that are just happening as a result of the issues of trying to figure out who the nation state is in this period. And on top of that, they're building relationships with the Soviet Union. We're talking about the USSR as this space for a partnership, but that relationship is a lot of pressure comes from the United States, because at this period, the U.S. in some ways cuts off ties with what is China. The U.S. supported the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, but once that party is no longer in power, they cut off their support for what we know of as China today. And so what happens is now they have to lean heavily on this one particular country to be their sole support. So this lean to one side strategy of the U.S. in some ways put tension on the Sino-Soviet relationship that really in some ways shapes these ideas and thinking about what that looks like in terms of China as its nation state as a communist country under the CCP. And so what happens, we see in many cases there's this idea of the CCP, due to these questions and the ways in which they're not seen as a legitimate power in the early years before they're recognized by transnational and internet and multinational organizations such as the institutions such as the United Nations. We see that they are in some ways trying to show that they are legitimate. There's legitimacy claim, and to show that we are the legitimate government of China. And we see this idea of legitimacy being one of the many forces that's drawing some of their policies and their outreach, especially as relates to their foreign relations policy. How do we show that we are legitimate? How do we get other countries to recognize who we are and our legitimacy? And how do we get other countries to engage with us and be able to be ambassadors for what we know as the new China? How do we get them to, in some ways, proclaim who we are, and how we build relationships? This question of building relationships leads them to seeing themselves in many cases as we're not the superpowers, we're not an emerging third world, we're just kind of this middle space, we're kind of this second world, if you will, we're kind of this middle space country, and we want to see ourselves as engaging with these emerging independent nation states that are coming out of their colonial moments. They're becoming, independent nation states coming out of the colonial shadows, and how we see them very much being a space of engagement. And so in this moment, moments like the Bandung Conference 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, is a space where China really makes its mark in how they see Zhou Enlai going, and how they're very much showing who China is and what that means in terms of their engagement with the Afro-Asian world in this moment in 1955. We also see the idea of them engaging in the non-alignment movement, where they're in some ways proclaiming the ways in which they can be an ally for these particular nations. And the reason why I put this picture of Mao and Du Bois on this slide is because Du Bois is very much part of that foreign relations enterprise. At his time when he visits his first visit in 1959 and subsequent visits in 1961 and 1963, he very much is championing the ideas of China and Africa. He writes a speech called China and Africa. He delivers a speech when he goes in 1959. He delivers it at Beijing University, or Beida, and he delivers a speech, and he's telling the people, China and Africa unites, and look at China as this model. And so so his words, his speech, and his clout that he has in this space, combined with the tours that Joe Enlai has taken through many parts of the continent, will lead to partnerships and allianceships and allyships being built in those particular nations. And so we see very early on in the Mao era, there's the idea of China-Africa. So China-Africa is not new. This is also not new. It goes back even further, but in the kind of contemporary, the moment of the CCP history, we see this has been the moment where this is some ways where we see how he gives some kind of legitimacy to what Mao is saying and how the ideas, and so Du Bois is speaking on, in some ways, kind of connecting these two different bridges, if you will. And we see this paying off because we see that in the 1970s, I think it's either 70 or 1971. I should know these dates. That's a bad historian. But the idea is that in the early 70s, we see that the multiple African nations vote the PRC in as representative of China. And so we see them getting this kind of recognition on the global stage as China as being this particular legitimate power. And so how all these kind of this global context and how we see these connections are being part of that particular narrative. Yeah. And I want to give this image as well because this is a propaganda poster. And I think in some ways, many ways, identifies and is a visual representation of the way in which we see kind of the Chinese foreign relations policy and the ways in which they're trying to engage with multiple groups, multiple continents around the world, and thinking through these ideas of what does this mean in terms of ideas of solidarity. And so one of the things I want to talk about is because within this conversation of solidarity, there is a conversation, there's an underlying conversation about issues of race and class. And in many cases, I think one of the one of the convenient vectors is that it relates to, we can use examples from African Americans and how we see this idea of race and class, how people are racialized, and how we think about class issues in the CCP, and how African Americans are this kind of vortex, if you will, of these kind of mixing of these ideas. And so thinking through legitimacy, thinking through a role, and what happens is that these ideas of thinking through African Americans specifically and how these other events are very much important. And so in terms of speech of solidarity from 1963 and 1968, these are speeches that are delivered by Mao Zedong himself, who delivered speeches in 63 and 68 relating specifically to African Americans. And so he delivers these speeches. These speeches are printed in the Remember Bao, which is the People's Daily, and they're printed every year on the anniversary of those speeches, and they're over. So there are speech that people in some ways know of. They know the language and the rhetoric. And in these speeches, his speeches very much frame kind of the conversations as it relates to African Americans as well. And so for 63, why that year? There's two things happening. One, that's the year that he meets Robert F. Williams, who is in exile. He has fled from the U.S. It was living in Cuba, and now he needs to flee from Cuba, and he makes his way to China with his wife and their two sons. And so they're a family in exile who is trying to flee persecution for false charges made against them in the United States. And so they have a wanted FBI wanted poster out for them because of the ways in which he was doing a lot of civil and political work through the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in Monroe, South Carolina. Monroe, North Carolina, excuse me. So the work he was doing and his, all the work he was doing to really, in some ways, try to get equality for African Americans in that community. For instance, if we're paying for a pool, and all of our taxes going to this public pool, can we not swim in the public pool without you all going in and draining the pool because, I put my toe in? Or how can we have access to the library? These basic, we're paying for them. How can we not have access to some of these basic public goods and public services? And so his work in some ways leads him to come to China. And so in 63, he and Mao, they meet. They decide that no, China's a space for them. So he comes up with his sons and his wife later on. But what also happens that year is the March on Washington. So the speech comes out in April of that year. Excuse me, August of that year on the March of Washington. So it's not coincidental that 63 and the date it was issued coincides with the March on Washington in the United States. 68 is also an important one because it comes out in April, and we know from Black history that this is also the month in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And so this speech is issued after his assassination, and Mao was really in some ways thinking through it, talking about the ways in which how we can support African Americans in their just struggle against American imperialism. And so there's some ideas that Mao taps into. One is this idea of global solidarity. This was not something that he invented. This was not new. This was an idea that we can see goes back as early as the early 20th century, as early as 1904, 1905, and not even further back before that. Mark Galatio, in his book on Black Internationalism on China and Japan, talks about how this is an idea that circulates and it becomes stronger in 1904 and 1905 after the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan is designated as a colored nation because it's non-white American, it's not white European nation beats a white nation. And so this idea of Japan becomes this model of, in some ways, how we can think through and how we can, in some ways, combat imperialism. And so this global close solidarity is an idea that Mao kind of taps into. And we see that many African Americans, there's an intention behind engaging with places like Japan. Gerald Horn has written a book about it, Facing the Rising Sun. Other scholars have written about where there was intentional engagement, but at some point, the Japanese imperialism could no longer be overlooked. And the idea is that who do we look towards next? And China became this new space right around the time of China switching, right around 1949. And so this idea that global solidarity is one that China, Mao Zedong taps into in his speeches, and he very much pulls into the rhetoric and language and continues that conversation, if you will. Very much framing the conversations in terms of anti-imperialist and anti-U.S. imperialism in particular, and thinking through the ways in which U.S. imperialism was impacting African Americans in some in different ways to other people, the populace. And thinking through this is, I think this idea of U.S. imperialism, though, this is one of those moments where it could have had more potential, but this is a moment where it actually falls apart. Because in this conversation, and they're talking about race and class, many of the conversation and speeches, and we'll look at a speech, a piece of it in a minute, and I have the link if you want to look at the link in more detail. The question in the conversation is, around this period, they're looking at race as kind of a subset of class struggle, with ideas that we know that race exists, we know how racism works, we know, but at the same time, if we overcome race, we can also use that as a means to overcome class struggles. And this understanding, in some ways, is a little bit flawed because it does not recognize that race and class are, one is not the subset of another. They're both equally intertwined in many ways, especially in American society. So think about, for instance, unions. Think about this, the idea of unions, where you have segregated unions in many industries. And those unions in some ways have different ways of kind of approaching questions, different issues and different struggles based on the idea of not just the class struggle that they share, but also the ways in which race impacts one group versus another. And so this idea of missing the opportunity to really critique both in some meaningful ways leads to the ways in which class struggle is seen as the overall goal. But in many cases, the idea of thinking through race is not very much in some ways done in a way that could really lead to pushing the point a bit further for the CCP to really push and to get that goal they're trying to strive for. There are some tropes of blackness in Maoist China. Thinking through ideas of what blackness is, what blackness means. And again, this goes back to this idea of China seeing itself as kind of this, they putting themselves as this leader of this kind of global solidarity, and how many cases what the role of African Americans would be in this space, the role of Black people more broadly, the Black diaspora, is a question that we think about. And I think a good source to kind of get to the sense of how that felt is, and Du Bois writes in his fictional story, Dark Princess. He writes about his protagonist, Matthew Towns, and about this moment. It's a dinner party. It's this moment where they're talking through and talking about what this looks like. And he was like, in this moment, he felt like we were all talking about the same thing, but yet I don't necessarily see it as what I'm giving is seen as equal or value. And so this conversation about we want to have these different groups together, but is race also being a part to we making differences and distinctions in a way that in some ways diminishes the ways in which each of us can contribute to this movement forward. And then there are some pre-49 narratives, one of the which is that some of my subjects I love to talk about kind of push back against. The biggest one is the idea of slavery, or the lack of knowledge about slavery. There is information understanding, but a lot of it comes through the lens perspective of thinking through the coolie trade that was very much at very much on ongoing at a time of certain texts being published and translated to Chinese. So in 1901, No, Uncle Tom's Cabin is translated by Lin Shu, and that translation process is a whole other story. But the idea is that Uncle Tom's Cabin comes in, and in this conversation, in many cases, he's in some ways talking about the slaves, but one from a perspective of is written by not someone who, in some ways, has experiences from an outsider view, and their voice, the black voice, is further diminished or distorted because he, in some ways, uses that black body as a metonym for the Coolidge labor experience. And so we see in many cases these kind of tropes about blackness and about slavery, connection to slavery, having this kind of it's a knowledge there, but it's not a detailed knowledge. And that changes when some of our research, my research subjects go to China and they introduce this subject more deeply, including my one of my research subjects, Abi Pankey, who is a Negro, he sings Negro spirituals, and he's a classically trained baritone like Robeson. And in his programs, he performs in China, he actually writes, translates the lyrics, has someone translate lyrics in Chinese of these Negro spirituals. And he writes a whole 2 paragraph explanation of where Negro spirituals come from. And so, again, adding some depth in that particular space, again, showing this idea of performativity, how he's in some ways talking about why these are important for him to perform in the China space in 1955. And then thinking about the ideas of political narratives, how in many cases, it wasn't all just politics. There are some political narratives that are being shaped, but thinking through the ways in which they're trying to make connections and relationships and how that does change in 1972 with the visit of Nixon, which is why I kind of cut off my research at that particular time period as well. Um, so to think about, oh, okay, I got a few minutes. Okay, let me get through this quickly. And thinking through these ideas of solidarity, I want to give you a visual in terms of what is happening. So this is a poster, this is a propaganda poster, and I love using this one. And I can, there's at the end of the slide, I do have a list of recommended sources, and one of which is the book where this particular image has come from, as well as a recent a blog from Poster House, which is a museum in New York that has, all posters. But this is a propaganda image, and it comes out of China. And this is the image where we see that they're taken from Mao's speech from 1968. Much of what's in the speech here, as we see printed in Chinese in top, is replicated from his 1963 speech. So I want to put two of the speeches kind of together in context. What we see here at the bottom is map of the U.S. And again, 1968, after the assassination of the king, we know that many cities were on fire. People were upset. People were visibly and vocally and rightly so upset. And so we see here is that on the map, the key shows out of the red flame shows a city where there have been some riots and some social unrest. People are pushing back against what's happening. And so we see they have in some places, they have a box that spreads out that gives a description in terms of what's happening in that particular city, that particular moment in time. And so, as we can tell, because it's in Chinese, we know who the intended audience is, the Chinese audience, and how they're in some ways trying to use this as a means to talk about, to educate, and to, in some ways, for those who can, the Chinese audience, the population itself, and how the use of propaganda posters in this particular image. And so, I want to kind of think about what Mao is saying because his speeches not only frame the posters in terms of how the layout is here, but also in many cases frames the ways in which they're thinking about and engaging with these groups of people. And so he's talking about in this speech, just a brief quote, thinking about the ways in which he's trying to show and explain and in some ways display his knowledge about the African American experience in the United States. And so I'm not going to read it all because it's a lot of text to read, but and I kind of broke the PowerPoint rules of having too much text, but I think it's a really good quote to think about the ideas of how he's trying to engage with the conversation of segregation, how he's thinking through these ideas and how there's some ways trying to really think through some of these moments and how they're trying to intentionally pull in in some ways and invite African Americans through into this process and thinking about how they're talking about racialization, discrimination, and thinking about the issues of class as well in these spaces. And then last but not least, certainly not least, one quick conversation about women. One of the things I think is a rightly so critique by Vanita Reddy and Sandhuta Andukar, they mentioned that in the Afro-Asian space, we see the images of like Du Bois and Mao, that kind of image over and over again to where those images frame my understanding of Afro-Asian scholarship, which is kind of where I see my research kind of in conversation with, to where it becomes this kind of heteromasculine fraternity where it's all about this international boys club they're all in some ways making the decisions, these political leaders. And while there is a lot of, conversation about why that in some ways is happening, it's also conversation about, we're thinking about non-state actors. Why can't we also include the women? Du Bois goes to China every time with his wife. Why is she not included in more images? Robert Williams goes with his wife. Where is she in the images? Why, when they publish Negroes with Guns in Chinese, that the images of her shooting a gun with him that's in the English version is taken out? So what is happening in these spaces where they're intentional in some ways thinking about how to reframe Black women in some of these spaces and conversations? And so one thing about, just give you a list of just a few, 5 of which I look into, and I'm looking into more, and I'm learning more as I continue to do my research, is Black women who are engaging in Black internationalism at this time period, including the women who are listed here. I like to, the image on the far right is Vicky Garvin. This is her in China. And she goes to China at the invitation of Huang Hua, who is the then China ambassador to Ghana. She's from New York. She was very much working about labor organizing. She was very much about labor rights and activism. And she goes to China under, goes to Ghana under Nkrumah. And she's there with the whole kind of cohort and community of African Americans who are going to Ghana in that space, one of which is Malcolm X. And so when Huang Hua invites her to come to China to teach English, they just come and teach English. You'll be a great person to teach. She's kind of like, what am I going to teach? How do I teach English? What am I going to do? And so what Malcolm X tells her, this advice, and she says, and this advice that she took to heart, is that I should teach English through African American history. And that's what she does. And so her archive is at the Schomburg. It's an amazing archive. You ever get a chance to get to it. And she has a very nuanced lesson plan. It's a very nuanced conversation that she's having with her graduate students. And she's teaching them about African American history and through and teaching them through English. And so she's very much a person who she actually, unfortunately, because of the Cultural Revolution that breaks out, she has to leave. She only teaches for 2 years before the Cultural Revolution breaks out. She has to stop teaching and moves to Beijing to work as an English language polisher. But she's just one example of the ways in which Black women are also, their labor and their organizing, the skills they're bringing from their previous experiences in some ways is part of the conversation. And the last kind of points, I'm thinking about the last 3 bullet points about archive visibility and internationalism really gets to the conversation about how do we think about the archive, Black Women's Archive specifically, how in some ways the role of being visible, how we in some ways make visibility more, something that's more accessible, how we make the other one who's in the space more visible. And I was thinking about Black Women's internationalism more specifically. And there's a great anthology by Keisha Blaine and Tiffany Gill that really gets into these conversations beyond just China. And they include an essay by Dale Gore, who writes about Vicky Garvin. And so I encourage you all to check out these different texts as well. So that being said, okay, I think I made it through. All right, here's a list of possible suggested additional resources in terms of different books that I like to use in talking about these topics as well and thinking through this as well. There's also a new archive that has come out recently that I'm still have not really dug into just yet. But the one second from the bottom is the Black Panthers in China. There is a record of them going. We do know there is a press release. We know there is a writing of them going to China in the People's Daily. But we now have images, and I think there's one I love is that you have a delegation of Black Panthers on the Great Wall. And so they have the bell bottoms, because the 70s are the bell bottoms and afros on the Great Wall. And it's just an amazing image to think about. They're going to China, what that means, because they also were engaged in thinking through Black internationalism. They were going to other places like, Vietnam, other places, and they make their way to China at some point as well. And then also, last but not least, the link at the bottom is Poster House. It's a collection put together by a someone who does work on thinking about civil rights movement in China. And so I think it's another nice companion piece in addition to the books I have listed here, including the Chinese posters where I took me to my posters from that particular text. With that being said, I look forward to your questions. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I have a tendency to do that. But I look forward to the question and answer portion, and I'm happy to talk more about these topics and questions as well. So thank you for your time and for your patience and for your ears. Thank you.
Wow, that is so wonderful. Thank you so much for that whirlwind talk. I'm like typing away massively trying to keep up.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, no. This is so good. Will you take some questions?
Yes.
Yay. Just a reminder to folks that you can either use the raise hand emoji or do your question in the chat and I can read them out or whatever. But yeah. Would you like to, do we have any questions?
I thought I saw a raise hand. Was it one? I thought it was amazing. No. Okay. I think I see one in the chat. Let me see. Okay. Oh.
I might start us off just quickly. Can you say a little bit more about Du Bois and Graham in their 1950s, 60s trips? Just Graham, like you wrote a piece on Du Bois particularly, but what about Graham's racial performativity in that light? And do you have any more on their relationship and how they perform their relationship there? Or?
Yeah, so Yin Sheng Gao, a scholar out of Ryerson in Canada, has a great article about Shirley Graham Du Bois. And in her piece, she talks about kind of, she introduces Du Bois, but she kind of mostly focuses on Shirley Graham and her time in China. And so when they're interesting. They're interesting couple to me. Like I think they're interesting. She's his second wife. She's younger than him, and so what happens is that some of her books. She was a playwright. She was an author in her own right. She wrote a biography of Paul Robeson that gets translated. Some of her other works get translated as well into Chinese. And one of the things I love about them is that. On one of their visits, they're in China kind of on October 1st, which is China is a kind of national day, kind of equivalent to our Independence Day. It's a huge day, and so they have this rostrum, this kind of this whole people studying on this the whole panel, just the who's who in the CCP, and the first Americans who are up there are him and his wife, and it's like this is interesting where people who are in the masses in China, the introduction to Americans is Black people, and I was like that's awesome. I just had to pause on that one. I love that moment. But I think one of their conversation, the way they kind of think about it, they write about it very much. Where Du Bois writes about it, Shirley Graham writes about it, and she actually does maintain friendships with people that she meets when she goes. Even after Du Bois dies in 1963, she continues to go. She goes and continues to travel there. Unfortunately, she does have cancer later years in her life. She goes to China for treatment, but when she dies, she's actually laid in state. So she dies in 1977. She's laid in state in the Chinese building in Beijing, which I'm thinking that's an honor that's amazing for anyone. And so this idea is that she continues to have ties in where she's a very personal person. So you can see in some of the pictures and things where she's very much about engaging with people and having those conversations and really being a part of trying to understand what's going on in China, trying to be part of it and trying to think about furthering those ties and that legacy even after Du Bois died. And so I love her narrative. And so, and just one, I think it's interesting. She wrote her biography of John Brown also gets published in China in some interesting ways. I'm like, why John Brown? I still don't understand that one yet. But her works and things, her legacy is still there as well. And so she has a moment. But in terms of a couple, they do. You do see them in some ways engaging in these conversations. They go out to, part of kind of these diplomatic circles. They're going out and being part of this kind of who's who, and how they're in some ways representing so much. And so I think for me, and I think about my research subjects, I had my own experience of. Understanding what that kind of weight might be, because they're not representing themselves. They can be themselves, but also in some ways, for someone who's never encountered an American, let alone a Black American, they are representing everything that they think, or they might, shape their ideas of Black Americans. And so I'm pretty sure that some ways there might have been also in their minds a deal of self-censorship. I had experience in China where I was there one summer in grad school, just researching. I think I'm a fun person. I guess I thought it was fun, but it was crazy where I was just with my friends who lived there. They were expats who had actually started a business. And I was hanging with some of their friends, and they were like, and one of their Chinese friends was like, I love you and I love all Black people. And I was like, whoa, pause. That's heavy. That's really heavy for me. And so I made me think about more intimately about what some of my the internal struggles. I can't necessarily tap into those because I don't have the writings, but it made me think more critically about, what are they showing, but also what are they not showing and expressing, and what are some of the ways where they're kind of thinking through this, and what are some of the filters they're having to navigate themselves.
Yeah, it really speaks to what you were talking about racial performativity here, and the ups and downs of that. There are two questions in the chat here. One is about this period, and then another comes to more contemporary time. So I'll read the first one about this more Maoist era time, and then get to Annie's question. How is Maoist CCP outreach to African Americans distinct in rhetoric or character from their outreach to colonial African countries? And did the Chinese notion of Black solidarity advance a Pan-African view, or did the prominence of the US as a target prompt more nationally specific strategies?
Oh, great question. So to the first question about was there distinction? Yes, they were making a distinction. So one of the patterns I noticed is that pre 1949, idea of black or who is black is like a blank slate. It's just a blank umbrella, and it can be anyone who is seen as darker. And so in kind of pre 49 conversations, have to tease it out what they mean by black or blackness because it can be anyone who is seen as darker or dark. We do see post 1949 in the Chinese Communist Party's rhetoric, they're making distinctions. A lot of it is along kind of into your second question on the lines of nation states and nationalism. And so they're making distinctions in terms of African Americans making specific calls to them that can some ways pull them into this conversation because they are not necessarily a nation state within themselves. They're not the continent. They don't have the continental presence like Africa. You can't just say, they say Africa, Asia, Latin America unite. You can't say the same thing for African Americans. And so they're making distinctions in their language. They're making distinctions in terms of trying to make sure that they have specific references to that experience. So in the speech in 63 and 68, Mao was very, strategic in terms of thinking through very particular historical moments to talk about and engage with African Americans more specifically. So there is a distinction being made in the language, and it is on the lines of nationalism. Their engagement with people like Du Bois does bring a pan-African element to it because he has that presence. But the CCP is not doing a lot of pan-African work themselves because we don't see them in some ways bringing these groups together. We see when Du Bois is there, we don't see, him and Kwame and Whitney Nkrumah, we don't see them having these moments of pan-African development, at least not in some ways orchestrated by them. These individuals might do it themselves when they're in Beijing and in similar spaces, but for the CCP, it is a distinction being made. We can see in the language and the rhetoric and even some of the images. Listen, the propaganda posters, the way they in some ways depict African Americans and how they very much use, you can tell it's African American because they always have a symbol, it's somewhere in the image, somewhere in the corner or the background, the capital, the DC, like a dome. So it's the US. And they also have distinction made between when they're talking about Africans and they're talking about the different aid and development there as well. So there's a distinction being made on multiple fronts. And it is in many cases along ideas of national lines. They're not really engaging in the Pan-African discourse that could have been developed, but they did not engage in the Pan-Africanism. No. But great question. Thank you.
Yeah, really great. And then Annie has a question that's more recent. How would you interpret the way the Chinese government targeted Blacks in China during COVID-19? I'm also curious that not very many social justice upholders are critical or even aware of anti-Black practices in China, but mainly focus on the US.
Yeah. And so this has been a conversation I've been having recently, especially not only the anti-Black kind of COVID-19 backlash, but also just recently this year for, not the first time, but, second or third time they have had blackface again in the Chinese Spring Gala. So this is, so for those of you who are not aware, Chinese New Year is huge. It's 2 weeks, and everyone in the country has time off, and they have all these dinners and celebrations. It's an amazing time. I actually was in China one time for Chinese New Year. Best party of my life. It's 2 weeks of partying. It's amazing. And so what happens is that everyone is traveling more and about, but also they have the CCTV, and it's kind of represents the, kind of the national program, and everyone has access to it. So you have a whole country who can watch this program. And for the second time, it was very clear they've had, it was supposed to be like China in the world. And that was supposed to be like China around the world. And so they had different performers, and dressed in different clothing from different countries. But when they mentioned Africa, they still had this kind of blackface. It wasn't as bad as a couple of years ago when they had the blackface and the body enhancements, but it still was as problematic. But I think there is some contemporary lessons to be learned because I think a lot of these the anti-Black sentiments that are happening is so much for me kind of confusing because I think about this particular period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where there's a political and kind of an intentional outreach and they have engagement in this space, but then kind of what happens, and I don't want to say it's because just globalization, that's part of it, but it has to be something else that we're missing in terms of why the shift away from this kind of intentional engagement to the ways in which it's very much about this kind of blase ideas. And not just to mention the backlash. You have the museum exhibit. You had the dish the detergent ad. There's many different examples, and they continually to be happening in China. So I guess my kind of question is, what is happening at different scales? We know that there have been more institutions being built as China is engaging more with various African nations. We have more institutions that are coming together, have more collaboration, but that seems to be at the governmental, kind of the national level. But in terms of an institution academic level, but in terms of the everyday individual level, I'm not sure what has been done to in some ways engage in those conversations to where this kind of ideas or these behaviors are in some ways challenged or pushed back against. And so as China is growing and is having more engagement with other parts of the world, they also in some ways have to have in some ways kind of have a conversation amongst themselves about how they're going to have to think about an engagement, because as China is going to grow in other parts of the world is also going to come to China, and how they're going to have to think about these ideas as well. So I'm kind of interested to see how that's going to play out, how they're going to engage in these conversations to really do more labor. I know of different individual, different groups that are doing it, but I need to have it, but I'm hoping to be a concerted effort at some point. I was recently alerted to the fact that they put out their white papers, I think it was last month or in January, about humanitarian efforts. I'm hoping that they're going to think about, the CCP also think about, these questions about race and anti-Blackness as well, think about human rights issues, and not deflect to other parts of the world. So you have your own questions. Because one of the things I always get when it talks about Black Americans is we did not have slavery, so therefore we're not racist like the US. Or we don't have races, we have Shaoshu, these ethnic nationalities. So therefore we're not racist. But there is what I call networks of difference, these distinctions that are being made on ideas of identity and formation. And those lines are going to start blurring more and more as we have more mixed race and biracial children who are going to be born through these connections and the ways in which people are, China's changing, the demographics are changing. And so I'm hoping that these are going to be conversations to be had moving forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. Other questions? Dr. Brown? I have so many, but I don't want to monopolize.
I got a question, Charlene. Let me send it to you. Oh, there, it appears it's in the chat now.
Okay.
From Douglas?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think it could be due to the Deng era foreign policy shift, as in the PRC avoiding the issue to avoid angering the US, and indirectly working with the US in aiding UNITA in Angola and Renamo in Mozambique during the 80s?
And that could be, thank you for the question. I think that could be part of it, because the Deng era did bring in a new ushering in of this kind of openness, thinking about the way in which China could be part of the world in this different way, kind of coming off the heels of the Cultural Revolution, trying to in some ways, one, heal the country from the trauma that was the Cultural Revolution, but also thinking about how to engage in the world and the shifting global dynamics, especially of globalization, and how do we in some ways find our ways, how do we find a way to open up, Gaga Kaifeng, to open up reform, and how we do this particular initiatives. So I think that's part of it, but I feel like there's something also missing. I feel like that's part of the narrative in terms of the shift. I think in terms of why we see this change from political to more kind of to cultural. But I think another way to think about it too is thinking about what is the power of these kind of cultural connections as well, these political connections. So I know one of the images is that a lot of times in China, the kind of ways in which you see kind of Black culture is through kind of pop culture means, through films and through sports. Have Stefan Marbury, who's like, he's a superstar in China. This man has a whole museum in Beijing devoted to him. And I'm like, this is wild. And so I think there is a shift. I think the cultural connection is still there, but trying to find the ways in which the culture is seen as powerful. And I think also to your second part of the question, they are doing two different outreaches to two different groups. And it gets back to the question that was asked before. Are they making distinctions? Yes. And are they making it along the lines of nation states? Yes. I think that's part of the issue where this Pan-African identity is not being had. But I do know is that I went to a conference, Black Liberty China, an amazing organization that does a lot of work and kind of putting out what they're doing in terms of how they are engaging with China, how China's engaging with them back. that a conference this year in January, and the Pan-African conversation is being had amongst these different nations, because as China is moving more into the Caribbean now, they're moving more into these different places where we now start to see more South-South connections being made. And these conversations are being had amongst themselves about how do we engage with China. So I do feel there's going to be sometimes a shift to where China's not going to be, it's going to be kind of a part of the conversation, but not the one who's spearheading the conversation. And I have a feeling it's going to be shifting very soon in terms of what I saw and witnessed and heard in that conference, where these conversations are being had as well. But I do think they're going to make the connections themselves, and in ways in which China has not made the Pan-African connection. These institutions and individuals are going to be doing those.
Right.
I don't know if I answered your question at all. I hope I did. I never know if I'm answering somebody's question.
Yeah. We have another question from Christina. I'm interested in the interactions between gender and Blackness that you brought up. How do you see Black people struggling, fighting for legibility in China? What about Black women? Is race negotiated through gender, or is gender negotiated through race?
Ooh, that's a heavy one, and that's personal for me. I felt that one because I've been in that particular space. I think one of the ways, and I've in some ways think through this question is thinking through not only my own experiences, but more so through the experiences of my research subject, and how in some ways they are and how their positionality in terms of if they are married or they single, if they are going in different ways, how they, have children, don't have children. And I give an example is that Mabel Williams, the wife of Robert F. Williams, she goes to China. She's helping him put out the newsletter. She's doing the work. She's proofreading, writing, helping edit. She's doing all the work as well. But she's also raising 2 kids. And so she has a different experience than someone like Vicki Garvin, who's going and she's by herself. She's a single woman who's teaching, how her experience is different. And so for me, what I'm trying to do is try to think about one, teasing out the experiences. So I don't have a monolith of the Black woman in China. But 2, also thinking about it in more contemporary terms, to where when I go, I'm not sure what they had to navigate prior to going to China. I'm not sure if they had any idea of Black women. The idea of what Black is was there, but Black women, not so much. And I still have felt that myself. We're going to China even in, in the 20th and 21st centuries. The idea of Black women, so Black Americans exist. That's already a big issue. Oh, the Black people in the US. And then they say you're a Black woman, that's another dimension to it. And so in many cases is where I'm trying to figure out, in some spaces, sometimes is I'm negotiating my gender through my race, or my race, my gender. Is not always a one-to-one. It's not always the same concept. And so I give an example. My good friends from high school, he played basketball overseas, and he was in China, and I was in China one summer, and we met up and we were in Beijing, and we went out, and he's 6'8". So first of all, he's 6'8", and I'm 5'8", so he's like a foot taller than me. He looks like a basketball player, and so of course he does not speak Chinese. So I had to be a translator. But it was one of those moments where we kind of see, in some ways, I could see in our exchanges, in the way when people talk to us, in versus me versus him, in that one particular moment when we're out and about, the ways in which we see gender has a different conversation. In many cases, the Black female, the way to understand Black women, comes through television. When I went to China in college in 2005, Desperate Housewives was popular. But Desperate Housewives, you remember that show, they did not have good depictions of Black women. They had Alfre Woodard, who her character, she had 2 sons. One who was seen as mentally handicapped, he was locked up in the basement. The other son was a murderer. And I was like, this is what I have to navigate, because students were learning English through these shows. And so they were learning English, but they were also learning something else as well. And so when I was there, I was told, well, you're Black, so, no one's going to bother you. And I'm like, what does that mean? Not going to bother me. But you're seen as violent, this and that, because in addition to the shows that were popular, you had these B movies that were like these very bad, low budget movies that have all these stereotypes in them as well. And so in some cases, you're not sure what you have to navigate in terms of race or gender. And sometimes it's both. And sometimes you're trying to figure out both of those juggle both of those at the same time. Or sometimes one is more a problem than the other in terms of having conversations. Last point I would say is that the last time I went, second to the last time I went, Medea films and made their way across the ocean. And I was like, and now I have to deal with this representation of Black women. And so again, the ways in which you're having to navigate those spaces and have to have those conversations. And so sometimes it's a matter of just, doing, how do you want to approach that situation? And I know other people who are also part of the Black China Caucus, they have different experiences as well, especially of the Black women, but it's ideas that we just have to figure out in that moment. should I approach it through, looking at this from this lens or that lens, or how do I approach it? And so in many cases, it's just a situation by situation, and how you just best navigate, and manage and navigate that space. Yeah. That was helpful. Oh, okay.
Ew. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions for Dr. Brown? I might sneak one more in at the last one here. I don't know, maybe that'll be our last one, but I'm thinking back to Du Bois and his trips in 59 and 60. And I read one of the pieces that he wrote right after he traveled there, The Great Miracle of China, that one.
Yes, yes.
So amazing. I don't know how to think about it. It's just that it's glorious praise of the PRC and the CCP's goals. And so thinking about the Kelly and Esch piece on Black Like Mao, thinking about Black liberation movements and how radical Black activists were seeing the CCP themselves at the time. And then vice versa, you say Mao and other translators were representing African Americanness. So there's sort of this mutual viewing each other from afar, mutual objectifying, I guess, for various political agendas. Anything to say there about that process of mutual objectification for, it seems so intense that Du Bois was there in 1959 at the cusp of the Great Leap Forward.
Yes.
Right. I mean, you know that nobody knew necessarily that was going to unfold, but
no.
Or
absolutely. And that's one of the kind of critiques, because he goes back a few more times, and people are like, why do you never talk about it? What's happening? But again, think about it. In these kind of curated tours that they go on, it's very much like, we're going to show you this new China we're talking about. So they might show you this factory, they might show you the things they want to see. And that's why I love Abi Panky. He does not, that when he leaves China, China's like, we can't work with you because you don't buy, you're not buying the Kool-Aid, basically. Because he asked me questions. He's like, well, you showed me the same factory 3 times. I've seen this same school twice. What else is there to see? And so you do have those who are pushing back, like, I think this is good, but what else is there? And so I think he's one of the people who kind of pushes beyond this kind of this moment of like, I know what you're trying to do, but at the same time, this is not in some ways pulling the wool over my eyes. And so in the moment where I think about people like Du Bois and others, people like Robert F. Williams, he's there during the Cultural Revolution. He's in China, the culture, he's in Beijing. And he's living in Beijing, and he does not write about it at all in his newsletter that comes out in those years. Because he's there they're paying for him to live and his family. He has 2 sons in school. So he knows the teachers. And he mentioned in later interviews, I have seen my son's teachers paraded through the streets. So he knows what's going on. But this idea of and I think it goes back to thinking about the ways and the color solidarity in some ways and thinking about my subjects, where they were trying to, in some ways, trying to figure out what's the threshold, where can we in some ways, what's the cutoff point? Because they knew that Japan was increasing in its aggression in the Pacific arena. But ideas like, how far can Japan go before we said we can't look to them anymore? How do we figure this out? Because the idea of a hope or possibility, what they can offer us, is that going to outweigh with the actions they're doing overseas? And I think that's the same thing that happened with China in this moment, where the idea of how much can they do before we know what's actually happening? How we know what's, in some ways, how do we think about disengaging ourselves from them in terms of their policies and practices that do not align or in some ways meet with our expectations? And so why it's very clear the intention of the CCP, and I think, again, going back to Anne-Marie Brady's book, she's very much about how they have these different institutions, organizations, and these culture tours and these friendship associations that is very intentional about what they're trying to do in their outreach and who they're reaching out to, because they're reaching out to African Americans who have a platform. Du Bois has this, he has a base, and he has a voice, and he has a recognition and a name in the Pan-African world. Robert F. Williams has his newsletter, The Crusader, that has circulation. Abi Panky, they call him Robeson #2, which I'm like, that could be a little bit disrespectful. But the idea is that they call him because he's an international performer. He's a contemporary of Robeson, and he has a platform. So they're very intentional about who they reach out to, but also thinking about the ways in which these individuals are engaging with, are thinking about and thinking through what can we do in some ways to talk about what are we trying to get out of this conversation, out of this meeting, out of this relationship, and what it can look like. And so I think this kind of mutual, almost like a tango, I said that they're talking at each other. And I think that's one of my frustrations, where they're talking at each other, not talking to each other. And in some ways, their own agendas in some ways lead to them not being able to have real conversations, because while Mao gives these great speeches about supporting African Americans, he does not in some ways see race and class as what they are, and how an African American experience, how those are both in some ways impacting African Americans in some equally problematic ways. He does not engage in thinking through talking about questions about, for instance, Ari Pankey. He is a Black man who has his wife is white. They're Americans. He does not critique the idea of, like, in America, your marriage would be seen as illegal. What is that about? So there are some moments where there could have been deeper engagement, but they're so busy trying to talk at each other, where they're not talking with each other about how they can push this agenda forward in some meaningful ways. So I think for me, that's one of the kind of frustrations. And not to mention, in the speeches, Mao says support African Americans, but he never says how. So is it just verbal support? Is it going to give speeches? We're going to show kind of global solidarity, or are we actually giving them support in terms of means, in terms of weapons? There's no real tangible support we see in those speeches other than let's support African Americans. And so I think for me, that moment and this idea of like how we move forward beyond this point of conversation, that kind of is an example of how this conversation never goes deeper than that in some cases, where it's a bit frustrating. And I think for me, also thinking through the different levels in China, how far does it go down? Because if you are someone who, you think about the CCP, they bring in the opinion system. So they bring this new recognition system. Who's able to read what he's saying? Is it disseminated broadly? How is it disseminated? Who in China is part of this enterprise? Is it the cities? Is it the rural spaces? Who is understanding this particular understanding, and how do they understand and engage it? And so there's some things I can't necessarily get to as a historian. As much as I want to, I try to look at the local papers and get a sense of what's happening in the local presses, but even still, that limits my audience to who is able to read and to write. And so again, a lot of conversations about what's happening. Is it disseminated? Is it more entrenched? And on the American side as well, how many African Americans know that China's thinking about them in the civil rights movement? Who knows that they're supporting them? Is this information out there? They know they have a support from overseas. And so this talking at each other, but not to each other, is one of those questions that I'm still trying to, in some ways, entangle and trying to navigate and think through as a means of, this was great, but why does this moment not persist? And that's also part of the conversation where the roots don't really get to be built and go down a little bit deeper than they could have gone.
Yeah, I think it's so important to think that through in terms of the possibilities for third world solidarity, for Pan-Asian, Pan-Africanism. Yeah.
And the thing is that it happens more, they have a deeper connection. They build those connections with different countries in Africa, where they talk about guerrilla warfare schools, that they bring people over to study in South China, or they start to build projects like the Tanzan Railway, those kind of initiatives, or they're doing construction. So they actually do that engagement with different countries in Africa, but it does not happen in terms of African Americans. So again, what happens in that particular moment? Yeah.
Interesting. Trisha had a comment just about, I think, referring back to William's teaching in Beijing, right? A fine line to walk. A dear friend helped build the first international journalism degree in China at Xiamen University. She was there from 1985 onwards, almost 20 years. As a professor of sociology, her curriculum had to be politically neutral, and that was quite a challenge when teaching about underlying US press constructs like freedom of expression. She got by teaching critical thinking skills. Amazing journey.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's why we think about the curriculum. I remember I had a conversation with a colleague years ago, where in the summer he would go and teach African American history to grad students in the summer, but there's no real African American history curriculum. Mm-hmm. And so there's these curriculums that they're building now because of China Africa. But again, it's a question of building that fine line. And I think it's even more so today. I've unfortunately, through the era, this kind of current moment, it's just as tight, if not tighter now. And I've heard some horror stories from my colleagues in China where they can teach, what they cannot teach, and it's becoming, the crackdown on civil society. So I appreciate the the comment, because it's like there is a thereafter, hopefully, but right now it is a very, and for colleagues here, Chinese colleagues here, they're like, I'm on my campus, I feel like a pariah, or so it's very tense on both sides. But I like the comment where she was there for 20 years, and it gives me hope that it's going to be another bright spot, hopefully, in the future, because right now it is very challenging. It is very challenging.
Yeah, we have to have hope, right?
Yeah.
Douglas has one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. On the PRC training guerrillas in China, are there any books? I know they aided some groups like the Pan-African Congress's APLA, but didn't know some guerrillas were trained in the PRC.
Yeah, I can send you some links. I know there is China. Mao Zedong has a speech about guerrilla warfare from like 1937. He talks about. I know there are some books, and I can send you a link to some of those. I have to pull them out of my archive somewhere in my laptop, my desktop somewhere. But I'm more than happy to send those books. There are some books that they write about this idea of training and what happens in those spaces. Absolutely, yeah, I will. I'm happy to send that. Please, I will. Yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, I think we should let you rest. That was quite a lot of energy and just wonderful.
I hope I lived up to the expectations. I was so nervous.
Oh no, I feel like I just got schooled. I mean, there's just so much that we need to unpack. I'm so glad you're doing this work. So just thank you again, and please everyone join me in thanking Dr. Keisha Brown for this really wonderful talk. Thank you everybody for coming. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you.